So in this first episode, we're going to talk about what the course is about, and we're going to talk a little bit about why it is that one might want to study this subject. What's the course about? Well, it's about justice. It's about how we ought to organise our societies. And it seems to me that this is something that's, lawyers, training lawyers ought to consider, because after all, the law plays a very important role in structuring society. And if you think about it, the system that we study in law school, the justice system, is called the justice system, and it's called that for a reason. The courts are called, most of them, courts of justice, and many of the judges who work in those courts are called justices. Why is this? Well, of course, it's because there's supposed to be an intimate connection between law and justice. The job of law is to do justice. Now, it may fail to do it in lots of areas. In fact, in some places, it may hardly ever do it. But that's its aspiration. The aspiration of the law is to do justice. And this is curious because if you think about it, there are a lot of people who work in this area, lawyers, practicing lawyers, judges, politicians, and so on, who've probably never studied justice as a subject. They have their own views about justice, their own what we call intuitions about justice. Now, let me just explain that word. It'll come up a number of times in this course. An intuition, as we use the term, is like a gut feeling about something. Right? Your sort of your initial, uneducated, unreflective feelings about something. And look, we all have intuitions about justice. But the question is, why should anyone care about somebody else's intuitions about things, their gut feelings about things? We're going to go beyond that, beyond our gut feelings, beyond our intuitions in this course, to examine those intuitions and to subject them to critical scrutiny. Because it is a curious fact that although we're training for work in the justice system, very few of us will ever actually study justice as a subject. Well, when I say few of us, I mean few of your colleagues, of course. You're all going to study it now, for better or worse. Okay, so in other words, these appeals to justice seem on the face of it to be nothing more than an appeal to one's own, the judge's own, personal political preferences. And we might want more from them than that, actually, right? We might want them to actually think about the different views of justice that have been promulgated by people in the past and to develop a more educated understanding about what justice requires than just one's own gut instincts. And that's what we're doing in this course. We're going to consider our intuitions. Our own gut feelings are very important, but we're going to test them. We're going to challenge them by examining leading theories of justice that have been promulgated by leading figures in the past. So that's what we're going to do. Now, in this course, we face a problem, right? And it's a problem that's hardly unique to this area, but it is a problem that we face. And that is that justice isn't something that we can find, right? We can't do studies on it in the way that, say, natural scientists study their subjects. Geologists can study volcanoes, and so we can't study justice in the way that geologists study volcanoes or in the way that chemists study chemical bond. We just don't have any kind of experimental tools or anything of the kind that we can employ in this context. All we have in this area is argument. So people put forward arguments and then people dispute those arguments. That's all that we've got. Now, when I'm talking about argument, I'm not talking about, heated disagreements between people. I'm talking about an exchange of reasons with the aim of convincing someone. So the idea of an argument here is to provide reasons why someone should come to a certain conclusion. So what we're going to be looking at is theorists who provide reasons why you should think that justice is so-and-so, is such and such. Okay, so what we have here in this subject are arguments, and some arguments are good and some arguments are bad. And our task is to work out which arguments are good and which arguments are bad. We won't find any definitive proof in this area. So it's not like natural science. We can't do experiments and just discover that certain views are wrong. We can't do that. That doesn't work that way here. Right? All we've got are arguments, and we have to pick through the arguments and work out what arguments are good and what arguments are bad. And you have to form your own view about this. Okay, you may end up agreeing with me, you may end up disagreeing with me, and that's fine. There's no problem with that. We all have to come to our own conclusions, but we have to do so on the basis of the arguments that are going to be presented to us over the duration of this course. Now, the fact that there's no definitive proof in this area leads some people to be pessimistic about the subject and wonder what the point of studying it is. This is a view that's very common amongst natural scientists who think, well, you know, if you can't prove it, what's the point of studying it? And I think there are a number of ways to deal with this issue. And one way is just to consider what the alternative would be. So if we aren't going to, not just us, but as a community, as a society, if we aren't going to debate justice in this way, this sort of reasoned, argumentative way, not heated, but reasoned, argumentative way, if we're not going to do that, what might we do? And I think there are only two alternatives to the kinds of things that we're going to be doing in this course. There's only two alternatives to reasoned argument. One we might describe as rhetoric. Rhetoric is about trying to get people on your side, not by giving them good reasons, but by saying stuff that they like, basically. Giving them slogans that appeal to them, for example. Appealing to their prejudices. Appealing to their emotions, their gut feelings. And there seems to be quite a lot of this in the world today. In fact, one of the things that's happened, I think, during my lifetime is that this kind of approach to particularly the political world, the political realm, is becoming increasingly prevalent. So there seems to be less and less reasoned argument with people and more sort of sloganeering and appeals to rhetoric. And the problem with that is it tends to produce factionalism in the sense that there are people who, to put it as simply as possible, there are people who like one set of slogans and there are people who like another set of slogans. And those people stop talking to each other. They just listen to their own slogans and don't communicate with each other anymore. And you get these big divides in society. And that seems to be, again, something that's happening more and more in the world that we live in. I'll just adjust this camera slightly. The other alternative to reasoned arguments, the first alternative is rhetoric. The second alternative to reasoned argument is war. Fighting, basically. If you can't convince people to do what you want to do by reasoning with them or by rhetoric, you fight. Now that might sound alarmist, but that was precisely the situation that was faced by the thinkers that we're going to begin the course with, by a bloke called Thomas Hobbes and another called John Locke. Hobbes wrote during the period of the English Civil War, so this is 1642 to 1651, and to cut things back to their most simplistic, this was a war, a civil war in well, let's just say England, but it affected other parts of what we now know as the United Kingdom and Ireland, but it was centred in England. And at its simplest, this was a war between those who believed that the king had a God-given right to rule, subject to no earthly restraint, and those who believed that subjects had God-given rights that no one, not even the king, could ignore. So on the one hand, you had people who thought that the king could do anything, the king had been appointed by God and could do anything, and on the other hand, you had people who thought that no, God had given natural rights to people and the king was not entitled to violate them. Now, Hobbes saw, and this was an enormously important discovery. In fact, I would argue the most important discovery in the history of political thought. Hobbes saw that because these sides could not argue with each other, that is, that they could not engage constructively, they could not reason with each other, all they could do was fight. And that's indeed what they did for this period, you know, the 9 years of this 19 years of the Civil War. So Hobbes' entire project was based around trying to get people to see that simply standing on their beliefs, you know, standing up for their beliefs, no matter how sincerely you held them, would lead to civil war. So just getting people to say, this is what I believe in, this is what I'm going to do, if that's the way people are, that will lead to civil war. Hobbes' entire project is to get people to see that, to realise that that can't be the way to construct a civil society. What you need is to be able, and this is Hobbes' central observation, and it's so important. Right? It's so important in part because I think we really haven't learnt it yet today. This Hobbes' central realisation is to see that the key to politics is to be able to work out a way of living with people who fundamentally disagree with you. In fact, to work out a way of living with people whose views, whose sincerely held views, you find repugnant. Okay, and it's worth pausing to think about this. For Hobbes, this is the central role of politics, the central question, the central issue, the central aim. Right? The central goal of politics is to create a situation in which you are able to live with people whose views you may find repugnant. Because the only real alternative to this at the end of the day is war. And that's worse than anything. Now that's Hobbes. That was a situation that Hobbes was writing. And he was writing during a period of war. And he was trying to create a situation in which peace could come and survive. The second theorist that we're going to look at, John Locke, wrote the work for which he's most, in this area for which he's most famous, during what's known as the Exclusion Crisis. The Exclusion Crisis was an attempt to prevent James II from taking the throne in England. In England and Scotland. It failed. He did end up taking the throne, although he was forced to flee the country and was eventually, well, replaced during the Glorious Revolution with William and Anne. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But the reason that Locke wanted James II excluded from the throne was because he believed that James II would govern unjustly and that revolution would be the result. I mean, religion had a lot to do with it. I mean, James II was Catholic, and the fear was that James II wanted to do in England what Louis XIV was doing in France. And so the idea was we couldn't, let's get this guy. We don't want this guy as king. Now, as it happens, as I said before, James II did ascend to the throne and a revolution did occur. So Locke was right about his prediction about what would happen. The book that he wrote was not actually published during the Exclusion Crisis. It was published later, after this revolution in which James was removed from power and William III, William of Orange, became king. And it was published in an attempt to ensure that the new king, William III, would be accepted and that no further revolution would take place. So the idea was, he wrote it to try and get James excluded from the throne to prevent a revolution. Well, that didn't happen, but then he published the book after the revolution in an attempt to get the new king accepted so that there wouldn't be another revolution. So these were turbulent times. This was a time of, broadly speaking, war, although the Glorious Revolution itself involved little bloodshed. Nevertheless, these are times of major social upheaval. Now, you might say, okay, that's just Locke and Hobbes. That's back then. What's it got to do with us now? And my answer is actually, I don't know that our times are all that different from the times of Locke and Hobbes. Surely we're not facing civil war in New Zealand at the moment, but there are similarities that would lead us to think that the fear of war of some kind is a legitimate fear in the modern world. One thing to think about here is the fact that, how can I put this? People seem to be less and less tolerant of each other on either side of the political spectrum in the world in which we live. So what we tend to get is people screaming at each other, trying to force other people to adhere to their views rather than reasoning and arguing constructively with them. And I think you can see this in various parts of the world. It's more evident than it is in New Zealand, although I think it is evident in New Zealand. I mean, one might think of what's going on in the United States, for example, with the sort of pro and anti-Trump groups. There's not a lot of talking between these groups. They just set themselves up as hostile, opposing camps and yell abuse at each other. And one might think that, one might ask oneself, what's the consequence of this? Where's this heading? And one possibility, I'm not saying it's going to happen and I'm not saying it's close, but if it keeps going this way, if the division gets more and more, then it is possible that there will be some kind of civil unrest or civil war. There are certain similarities between what's going on in the United States now and what happened before the Civil War. The big difference being that there's not a clear geographical distinctions like there was between South and the North. But anyway, these things are possible, and of course we're now living in as I'm talking to you now, it turns out, what is it, a third of the world is under some kind of lockdown. If we can't, due to the coronavirus crisis, if we can't find a way of constructively dealing with this, or don't find a cure soon, it looks like we may be heading for some quite significant economic collapse. And the last time there was such a thing, there was a rather major war that followed the Second World War. And I don't want to be alarmist about this, but I do think we're living in a time where constructively engaging with people, rather than simply saying, hey, this is the way I see things, I'm not going to, you see it my way or bugger off, right? But instead of that, saying, well, I see it this way, let me explain why I see it this way. We live at a time where that kind of constructive engagement with people is more important than it's been for 50 years or more. Anyway, okay, so more about why we might study the subject, even though we can't get definitive answers to the questions that we're after. And one thing to say about this is it seems to me that actually the most important questions in life often don't have definitive answers. Are questions like, quite down-to-earth questions in some ways, like, should I marry this person? Should we have children? How many children should we have? What career should I choose? Questions like this, which are very important in people's lives, they don't have definitive answers either, but it hardly means that they're unimportant. Another reason is that as lawyers, you may find yourself having to argue about justice, for example, in court. And just simply saying, well, my gut feelings are such and such is not going to convince anyone. You have to come up with reasoned arguments in order to convince a judge or whoever it is that you're trying to convince. So we're studying justice in this course. It is important to say, however, that our study is not comprehensive. We're only going to study a small subset of this subject. One way in which this course is not comprehensive is that we're only going to study one part of justice. We're going to study what is known as distributive justice. Distributive justice deals with the distribution of benefits and burdens in society. So the distribution of benefits and burdens in society. So it's the kind of justice that deals with the question, who gets what? There are other kinds of justice that may come up in the course, but we're not really going to spend any time talking about, though they're very important. One is what I call commutative justice, which is not justice about society, but justice as it relates to individuals and how individuals relate to each other. Another kind of justice that we're not going to look at is retributive justice, which is basically what you do when people break the rules. And you would normally study that in law schools in criminal law or criminology courses. So we're not just dealing with justice in the courtroom here, we're dealing with justice in society in general. All right, so in short, we're going to ask the question, how should our societies be organised? And we're going to answer this question by examining theories that have been presented by the most influential modern thinkers. But by modern, I really mean since the Renaissance onwards. Not everybody. We're not going to look at everybody because we can't. We don't have time. We're going to look at those thinkers who have had the biggest impact on the way people think about justice since the 1600s. We're going to discover reasons and views. We're going to discover their arguments, but we're not going to discover any definitive answers. you're going to be invited to form your own view about this. Right? That's an important part of this course. Right? You're not just asked to learn about what other people think. You're to form your own view about what you think. But hopefully that view will not just be your gut feelings about things. It will be informed by the theories that we discuss. Okay, and next time we're going to start with our first thinkers, Hobbes and Locke.